Hello there, welcome to the Young Cape. I'm Robert Dygan, and today we are with Dr. Peter Hammond, who is a missionary and a former soldier from Rhodesia, and who has participated in the independence movement for South Sudan. He's also a proponent of Cape independence, and today we will be asking him about several of these topics. Good afternoon, Mr. Hammond. How are we doing?
Well, thank you, Robert. I should just correct you. I was not a Rhodesian soldier. My brother was, but I was a South African soldier. So I was brought up in Rhodesia, but I served in the South African Defence Force. And yes, Sudan's been a major focus of mine since 1995.
And that started because of your missionary work there, I assume?
Yes, it did. I heard of the terrible things going on in Sudan, and I wondered if it could possibly be true. And so immediately after the Rwandan Holocaust, I hitchhiked across from Rwanda through Uganda, Kenya into Sudan. And I discovered the situation in Sudan was absolutely horrendous and began a major operation there. And in the next 6 years, I led 27 missions into Sudan, took in and smuggled in about 250,000 Bibles and books and textbooks for schools, tons of medicines, ambulance, helping the people in different ways, trained their chaplaincy corps, trained the medical corps. And it became very clear to me very quickly that South Sudan would be in perpetual warfare unless they redrew the map. And I was sitting down arguing with Colonel John Garang, the head of the Sudanese People's Liberation Army, and even the deputy Commander Silva Kiir, who at that stage was second command to John Garang, and explained to them, you need to fight for independence. And they said, that would be a good idea, but it's not possible. The best we could hope for is autonomy. I said, you will always be a persecuted black minority unless you redraw the map where you're the majority. Otherwise, the Muslim Arab North is going to continually outvote you and oppress you. You need to go for full independence. Well, John Garang argued with me on this as late as 2001. That's not possible. And by 2011, he is the first president of South Sudan, independent, internationally recognized South Sudan. So it was a great joy to be arguing with and discussing and leading and organizing leadership training programs for the what is the present leadership of South Sudan.
That's very impressive. One of the things that I've noticed is, so there are plenty of feasible independence movements, and there are plenty of states that have put an enormous amount of effort into putting themselves together. I mean, Somaliland, Puntland, these places have more cohesion than most states that are recognized by the United Nations, and yet they struggle to attain any recognition. And in not being recognized, they don't benefit from a lot of the economic and diplomatic benefits that that the rest of the countries in the world benefit from. What made the international community sit up and take notice and decide that South Sudan was worth giving independence to?
Oh, well, make no mistake, the people are independent and free in South Sudan because of their own efforts, not because of some international community or graciousness of America or anyone else like that, because nobody was interested. In fact, as the people in Sudan said to me, we are a hidden people fighting a forgotten war. And there were. There was no media coverage back in the 90s. What was going on in South Sudan was absolutely off the radar. Nobody seemed to care. And it was politically incorrect. So, you know, Muslim Arabs are not the enemy, and it doesn't matter what they do. Who cares? And besides which, the people of South Sudan, they might have been black, but they were Christian black. And so not exactly very popular in the whole narrative of the New World Order. So I actually had over 1,000, well over 1,000 public meetings, radio, TV, public meetings overseas in Europe and America promoting South Sudan independence. I took in filmmakers when the filmmakers were too scared to go, and I made some films of my own, which weren't so good, but later on they got incorporated into Pat Matriciana's films, Sudan, Hidden Holocaust, Terrorism, Persecution. Brought in journalists, 3 Days in Sudan was one South African television, a chap who did that, and brought in groups like Samaritan's Purse, got Franklin Graham involved, and recruited them And through the publications, and in fact, I went through 3 editions of this book, Faith Under Fire in Sudan, which the first one got me death threats from the Sudan government. So I thought, great, I produced one twice as big and then one 3 times as big. And these have been printed and sold by the tens of thousands around the world. And that helped market the case for Cape independence. So radio, TV, human rights conferences and meetings, getting onto BBC World Service, speaking to the people in America, getting into Jesse Helms's office and Foreign Relations Committee and others. And I worked Cape independence, South Sudan independence, I should say. And the people in South Sudan were needing to be convinced too, because they didn't think they had a case. And it took time to show, look, this has happened before. Switzerland is a product of secession. They secede from Austria. And the United States of America is a product of secession. They secede from Great Britain. Ireland, Republic of Ireland, seceded from Great Britain. Norway seceded from Finland just over 100 years ago, in fact. Norway seceded from Sweden, I should say. Finland seceded from Russia back in 1917. They just celebrated 100 years recently. And I was involved in Croatia and Slovenia when it was Yugoslavia, hearing the people talking about, we must be independent. And I heard this in 1989. I said, that's just not possible. Well, within a year, they were fighting for the independence, and within 5 years, Croatia had won the independence. Slovenia won the independence in an 11-day war. They called it the 11-day war. And then it was recognized by Yugoslavia. Czech and Slovakia, the first time I went to Bratislava, the people were arguing in Bratislava that we need independence from the Czech Republic. And I looked very skeptically, what chance they have? That became the Velvet Divorce, because in 1993, peacefully, without any violence, the Czech, Slovak republics separated. And Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were also talking about the independence in the 80s, and we were highly skeptical. I mean, there's no way Soviet Union will never allow it. Well, it didn't matter what they would allow, and it didn't matter that nobody in European Union cared. But Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they launched what was called the singing revolution. They couldn't protest much other way, so they celebrate the culture, and they had great singing festivals, and but one of the only things allowed in the Soviet Union. And they recaptured a lot of their sense of their national identity. And Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia won the independence without any serious bloodshed. And it was very impressive. Ukraine won the independence, Belarus. So I saw these different examples, and being a student of history and working in Sudan, I could see only one solution to Sudan, because 2 million people had died unnecessarily since 1955. When the British left, the war started. And the missionaries warned them. The British were warned by the missionaries, this will never work. You can't put Christian blacks in the same country as Muslim Arabs who have been enslaving them for centuries. How on earth do you think this is going to work? Make them part of Kenya, make them part of Uganda, make them an independent country, whatever you do, but don't put them with people who've got a different alphabet, a different calendar, a different language, different religion. It's different race. This is never going to work. And it didn't work. And millions died as a result of this insane policy of forcing Sudan together, whereas Equatorial Sudan, totally different in every way that you want to look at it from Northern Sudan. And the fact that the independence has been won gives us a lot of hope. So with this background, I believe that the same is true for the Cape. That the Cape has been an independent entity. It has existed for over 400 years. And for people to be celebrating 2 centuries of the Kingdom of Zululand, as they did a few years ago, is wonderful. But in Cape Town, we've got 4 centuries of our identity as the Cape of Good Hope. Why should we be under people who didn't even exist back when the Cape was beginning? There wasn't a dot on the map of Johannesburg or Pretoria back when the Cape had its own parliament. And so we've got a long, rich cultural heritage. And so I think a lot of the wars in Africa would be avoided by just redrawing the map, recognizing ethno-linguistic realities, demographics, cultural realities, and letting people decide for themselves, self-determination.
Well, that's very true. I think one of the just to underline that point. I mean, one could equally say that just South Africa as a whole doesn't doesn't have any real identity as a country, and it mostly sort of exists as a sort of abandoned imperial territory.
Very much. I mean, even the name South Africa, it's less the name of a country than a description of its position in the continent. South Africa, okay. But we've got rich country. In order to create the Union of South Africa at the point of a bayonet, I might add, after brutal scorched earth campaign under Kitchener and Anglo-Boer War, they forced the Republic of Transvaal, the Republic of the Orange Free State, the Colony of Natal and the Cape Colony into a union without a referendum. I don't think it had any serious legal ethical merit, because this was not just a shotgun marriage, it was a forced union without really the consensus of the parties. And Britain was the greatest imperial power at the time. They could do what they wanted. The Boer commanders had done their best to resist, but like Canada was put into a union, and like Australia was, so the British had this vision of the Dominion of South Africa, very much following the Canadian and Australian examples. And well, you know, it seemed to work for a while, but you could see everything starts to spin out of control at a certain point. In the last few years, we've seen a government that's not trying to bring about any unity, but you speak about expropriation, about compensation. They're stealing us blind. They want to kill us. They talk about, you know, literally, we've had presidents in this country singing, kill the Boer, kill the farmer, while farmers are being tortured to death by the hundreds. And how are you going to maintain a union in a country of people of 11 official languages? I mean, that's not particularly workable to start with, where the central government wants to kill people on the basis of their race, sings about it, and wants to abolish private ownership of property and all the rest of it. So obviously, with a failed state that can't keep the electricity running consistently and can't keep the water and the pipes running consistently, you're going to have different groups saying, wait a minute, why are we in this union anyway? We can do a better job on our own.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that is sort of constantly left, constantly left out of this is just because it's hard to convince most Western people to care at the moment, because the people who are holding the megaphones are promoting this, have imported this mode of thinking themselves. But we have a system that racially discriminates against all ethnic minorities. And as much as we're told that, you know, Biko blackness means anyone that isn't white is included in this big sort of idea of political blackness, we know recently there's a school teacher who called himself, who marked himself down as black and was sued by the government for falsifying BEE documents.
Exactly. So, for example, there's a huge support for Cape independence amongst the coloured community. Now, of course, those people who aren't from this area may not realise that there's distinctions in South Africa, serious distinction between the Indian, the Malay, the coloured, the black, the white, and even the Khoisan, what used to be called the Bushmen or the Hottentots, are identifying themselves very differently. So there's a greater sense of racial, demographic identity, cultural identity, linguistic identity. So it's not as simple as in America, where people say, oh, black or white. But over here, it's more complex, and you're aware of that. So I've had coloured community people explain to me, in Mitchell's Plain, in my area, there's not one single coloured policeman. We don't have a single policeman in our local police station who speaks our language, which is Afrikaans. They all come from Transkei, they all come from Eastern Cape, they all speak Xhosa. They don't know us, they don't care about us, they don't even speak our language. When we traumatized by crime, we go to the police station and we can't even communicate. They don't understand, they don't care. And why can't we have our own people as policemen in our own area? It's not that we lack coloured policemen, but they shipped off somewhere else by the central government. So you can imagine the anger of these people who are being terrorized by gang violence. And it looks like the police, the local police, are either in the pay of the local gangs, or they're apathetic, or they're incapable of dealing with it. Well, and so I understand they want independence. They're sick of this.
Yeah, I mean, from what I gather, there's what it looks like to me at the moment is a sort of much like the Chinese sort of program for Tibet, where they have affirmative action for their people who they deliberately place in strategic areas to homeopathically dilute the native population. And
That's a good
it's
example.
insidious.
That is a good example. And in fact, it's worth noting that the present administration in South Africa, the ANC, are in bed with the Chinese Communist Party. And it looks like they not only have studied there, but they've learned from their tactics. And the Chinese government, by which we mean the unelected communist dictatorship, the Communist Party of China, are heavily invested in South Africa. They even send their warships to our harbor. Now, just to give you an idea, because I'm a missionary, when I heard, we've got a Chinese warship in a harbor, I got a whole lot of Chinese Bibles and booklets and so on. I dashed down to harbor with several of my friends. And do you know, despite vigorous efforts in several days, we could not give one single booklet, Bible, tract, New Testament to a single Chinese sailor, not one of them. Now, to be fair, they were never alone. They were in groups, and but they would not even touch it. The terror, you could see there's no freedom there. Whereas when Russian sailors come to our port, you have no problem interacting with them, distributing things. They accept gifts. They talk. They take the Bibles. They might be wearing crosses and so on and St. Christopher medallions. But the Chinese, there's such a rigid fear. They plainly aren't allowed to take anything from anyone, and they're terrified of what will happen if they do. But the Chinese come in and they take up property. And what they did in Zimbabwe, where they expropriated the farms, and then they came in and they strip mined, and they found minerals like diamonds in the Moraine diamond fields, which used to be some farmland. The Chinese are behind this expropriation of compensation plan for South Africa. They are convinced that under our farms, which are feeding our people, mind you, that they will find some minerals that they're after, and they're raping the continent of Africa for minerals. They've got a tremendous appetite for minerals and forests and everything else. So the Chinese, we believe, are heavily behind this campaign, because you may say, well, how can they take away the farms? The farms in South Africa are feeding the nation. 40 million people are being fed by 30,000 farmers. Actually, it's now 26,000. What's going to, well, it's not like they care about the people who are starving. Same thing in Zimbabwe. The people starved after they took farms, but China gets the minerals. And what does the ANC get? Well, I'm sure they get kickbacks and they get whatever they get paid, but at the price of their nation. And, you know, a few million people dying of starvation, the economy being destroyed, that's a small price to pay for the kickbacks you can get from the Chinese government. This is what we've learned throughout Africa. And make no mistake, the Chinese government is in boots and all in South Africa, and the ANC are jumping to their tune.
Yes, this is all very concerning behavior. But this has been building for a long time. And yet we've largely seen most of the South African community has been resistant to seeing the ongoing decline as a serious problem. How would you diagnose that? Why do you think that we're so resistant to recognizing that the problem is insoluble? Why the taboo against pessimism?
Well, indeed. Now, of course, for myself as a missionary, and next year I will have been 40 years being a missionary to persecuted churches, working in restricted access areas. I've lived through 8 revolutions, been involved in, I've lived through 3 revolutions. I've worked in 8 war zones, and I've traveled in 42 countries, worked in 38 countries. So in my travels, I've got to understand how communism works, and I see what's going on, and I understand Africa. So I was never under any illusions as to what was coming with the ANC. And it's no accident that the middle letters of cancer is ANC, because a cancer is a cell that doesn't do any help and doesn't provide any health to the body. A cancer is, in fact, just rotting and eroding and corroding and killing the body. And that's what the ANC is doing. The ANC is a cancer government. They are just political parasites who are sucking the life out of the country, looting the country. This is a luta continua, to use the Portuguese term, a luta continua, but they mean looting. And what we've got in the ANC is the most incompetent, corrupt cabal of criminals and Marxist revolutionaries imaginable. And yet the average South African, especially white South African, seems to be in denial that you've got a government hell-bent, literally hell-bent, wanting to kill us all and loot everything we've got. And how do we explain this? Well, the first thing is guilt manipulation. The average South African has been so effectively guilt manipulated out of this mythology of apartheid and racism and oppression and so on. And even people who didn't live under it, even those who weren't even born under it, even those who fought against it, it doesn't matter. The guilt manipulation has been so craftily orchestrated by the mass media, which is in control of only two basic bodies, basically, control our mass media, and they've only got one tune and one narrative that they spin. Then you get the educational institutions, our education, our indoctrination gulags, which what they are pushing in the classrooms is and so divorced from reality that what we've got in South Africa is a brainwashed, guilt manipulated society. And the other key word is gaslighting. If anyone's seen the Ingrid Bergman film Gaslight, and it even got into the dictionary. Gaslighting is where an abuser manages to get the victim to feel guilty for everything that's going on, and then you get Stockholm Syndrome. So I think a lot of South Africans are under Stockholm Syndrome, where what was documented to happen in Stockholm, where a bank was taken over and the people were kidnapped and had explosives strapped to them, and the kidnappers threatened to blow up these people. And would you believe it, the people under the power of death by these kidnappers actually turned to identify with the kidnappers. And it's a psychological phenomenon that they found that many times when people's lives are at stake, they project onto their abusers the best of intentions. Maybe it's a way of avoiding reality that's staring them in the face. And we've got a lot of Stockholm Syndrome people. In Stockholm, they literally found the people who were being abused and held with guns at their heads and explosives around them were putting themselves between the police and the hijackers, the kidnappers, the bank robbers, in order to try and save their abusers' lives. And it doesn't make sense except as a psychological phenomenon. And I think what we've got in South Africa is guilt manipulated, gaslighted, Stockholm Syndrome individuals who've been brainwashed in many cases, and many on blatant denial of reality. Now, those of us who travel and see what goes on in other countries and come back and forth, we can see what's been done. But I'm afraid people who've just lived in this, they think it's normal to live in a society where there's litter and pollution and crime, and people want to burst into your home. You could be facing a home invasion, murderous carjacking any moment. You could have people killing you for nothing other than the color of your skin, torturing you to death on a farm, and they somehow think this is normal, or it's our fault. The victim's fault, blame the victim.
Yeah,
so
like in
really
his novel Disgrace, where the daughter says to him at one point, "This is the price of staying here and we deserve
it." That is a classic example of the disgusting situation we're in. And you would have thought that the most basic human instinct is self-preservation, and particularly for parents to want to protect your children, your grandchildren. Now, I am here in South Africa, and I've got my 4 children, 3 grandchildren. We're all here in South Africa. We're all committed, but we're armed, we're ready, we trained, we organized, we networked. We have no illusions about what we're facing around us, and we're working for Cape Independence because that provides a future and a hope for my children, my grandchildren. And I refuse to want to hand over to a bunch of murderous Marxist thugs what our ancestors built up, what we built up, what we have bled and blood, sweat, and tears we've poured in here to build up this civilization, the most magnificent civilization in Africa, and to see it destroyed around us, stolen from under our feet, and to have us maligned by the very abusers, criminals, and terrorists, and looters, and extortionists. Corruption is stealing 1/3 of the GDP, gross domestic product, South Africa. Every year, corruption is stealing 34% of the gross domestic product, South Africa. That's not talking about normal crime, just government corruption. And that's not even counting inflation or taxation, which is another form of theft. So we are really being looted, and we see a tremendous solution being divorce. Now, divorce isn't generally nice, but when you've got an abusive relationship, it might be the only solution. And when we've got a government that literally is singing about killing us and wanting to take away all of our property rights, well, then honest, and they've got 110 laws of racial discrimination against minorities in this country. Well, not for minorities, against the minorities. 110 race-based laws. In most countries in the world, affirmative action is to protect minorities, to empower the majority, which you would think doesn't need any empowering. So the situation is quite dire, and obviously we've got to deal with it. The biggest problem is, as you pointed out, a lot of people are in denial about the situation, and this is what we've got to fight. But fortunately, while average white seems to be in denial, it's amongst the colored community that we're finding most people who are most interested in Cape independence and most enthusiastic for getting rid of this abusive government, at least in the Cape.
Oh, that's very, very smart. I've noticed, however, that there is some debate about the form this will take. Do you think that how should I put this? The question of land and the demand for redistribution of historically appropriated land for racial distribution reasons. I suspect that this is not a question that will go away just because we've pulled the boundaries back to the Karoo. So have you given much thought? Have you had much discussion with people about
Yes.
the forms of land reform that, or at least the discussions that will be taking place around the Cape in this regard?
We certainly have looked into it a lot, and for example, there's no real case of any of the black nations having any claim to anywhere in the Western Cape anyway, because they weren't even here until very recently. In fact, you could have come to Cape Town back in the 1980s and you wouldn't have seen black people in Cape Town. It would be a rarity because they were busting mostly in the 90s, and especially after Mandela became president. And there's a huge attempt to bus in these foreigners to be able to sway the vote, the demographics here. But the Cape has never voted for the ANC, never, not in the 26 years of the ANC being candidates in the political elections. The Western Cape has got its own identity and has always voted for the opposition to the national ANC government. So when we look at the expropriation of property, interesting thing is there was tremendous provision made between 1994 and 1999 for any land that had been expropriated to be handed back. And actually quite a bit of land was handed back. Of course, none really in the Cape because that didn't really happen here. So what we found is the vast majority of people, when pushed, said, we don't want the land. We just want money to the version. So they still want to live in a city. You know, farms are a lot of hard work, and not everyone wants to get up early. Yeah, so we found a lot of these people after the expropriation thing, they're not interested in the land. They're not interested in farming. They just want something for free. Basically, that's what it comes down to. So if anybody has been abused, in most cases, under the extremely generous land restitution acts and so on that they had, that was organized in the negotiations, it was done. But the vast majority chose not to take the land, but rather to take financial compensation. And I think that's the general fact. Most of what the government's proposing now with expropriation without compensation is not to replace a productive white farmer with a productive black farmer. It's to take the land, all the land, and the state owns the land, and they lease it to those people they want for as long as they want to. So no, under the EWC, expropriation of compensation, it's not that a black man would get title deed and own the land. He would lease it from the government would own the land. And so what you're talking about is basically a nationalization of the land in the guise of a smokescreen of redistribution. So it's not at all honest. And if you happen to disagree with the government, well, you could imagine you'd suddenly find your leases expired and all that sort of thing. So this is nothing but control. And you see this in many countries in Africa where the government owns the land and you can't buy the land, you can't own the land, you can only lease the land from the state. And they've got all kinds of means of organizing this, and that's not going to help. But that's not the goal either, ultimately. The real goal is China wants to strip mine these farms to see if there's any minerals under it. And these farmers are in the way. And they don't care about how do you feed millions of people in the cities. Let foreign aid do that. And so basically it's taking away people's ability to be self-supporting and self-governing and making people depend on the state or on some non-government international organizations for relief aid. Where's the dignity in that? You can see exactly where expropriation without compensation goes, but just look at Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe had a phenomenal agricultural sector. Just 5,600 white commercial farmers were feeding not only 10 million Zimbabweans, but they were feeding people all over and exporting food and all the rest and doing well. They're the biggest employer in the country. They were the biggest foreign currency producer and exporter. On every level, the best thing going in Zimbabwe was the agricultural sector run by the commercial farmers. Well, once they took those over 5,000 farms, and some cases murdering the farmers, destroyed everything, what was the result? Thousands of millions of tons of relief aid needed to be brought into the country. More than half the population fled the country. Zimbabwe's got most of their population outside the country. I mean, where in the world have you heard of a country where more than half of the population lives outside the borders? And they depend on foreign aid. 95% unemployment in Zimbabwe. And that's not counting the more than 500,000 who've fled the country. So economic catastrophe. Zimbabweans who are highly educated, who have doctoral degrees, working as car guards and waiters in Cape Town because they can't get jobs. It's like in Cuba where you've got these people who, medical doctors driving taxis because they can get a better
I can tell you a
income.
very interesting story about that. I used to, the place I used to drink coffee at in Observatory when I was studying at UCT, was run by a member of the Communist Party, a white fella from Zimbabwe. And he was employing a Shona electrical engineer to do the dishwashing. And somehow he still felt that, we just need to try it again, just get it right this time.
Yeah, communism has been tried in over 48 countries, total, complete, utter catastrophe. I mean, you go to somewhere like Russia or Romania, and or Albania, and you talk about communism, and you'll hear some foul language. I mean, those people hate communism with a passion. And why? Because they lived under it. And then you come to the West and you find these people, it's a new and better world, and Bernie Sanders and all this. They have no idea of what they're talking about.
One of the most interesting angles, I think, because the biggest reason that Black people support communism in Africa at the moment is because they believe that it will give them control. And so for them, it's not so much an act of communism as an aspiration to national autarky, right? But we know historically that that a lot of the countries that went socialist in Africa were actually largely controlled by British business. I mean, for example, Tiny Rowland's sort of MI5 funded companies in Ghana doing business deals with Kwame Nkrumah to basically capture their entire mining infrastructure and build dams and stuff there. So it strikes me that it's a consistent pattern where you've got some kind of foreign colonial force employing a revolutionary government to centralize the single point of access to the economy.
Yes. In fact, right now, I can look onto my shelves and I can see The Best Enemy Money Can Buy by Professor Anthony Sutton.
Anthony Sutton, yes.
And Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. And there's a whole lot of documentation Professor Sutton did, Anthony Sutton, on how the communist revolution, the Bolsheviks, were actually bankrolled by capitalists in America. And he said, in fact, you see people like Armand Hammer, who was one of the richest capitalists in America.
Yeah, his grandson's a big famous Hollywood actor these days.
Yeah, and he, yes. So Armand Hammer's father was a major leader in the Communist Party in the United States. He's a major capitalist. He's funding the people in the Soviet Union. He could fly into Russia in his private plane, no problem. During the Cold War, no less, he could walk into Joseph Stalin's office without an appointment, which nobody in the Soviet Union could. And you know, they try to say capitalism, communism are two of these great enemies. No, what you've got is big business. And today, big tech and big pharma are in bed with big government. And they love it because it was explained to me like this in Zambia. You know, I was at one time arrested in 1987 under Kenneth Kaunda, presidential detainee, locked up in Lusaka Central Prison. And in there, I had quite an education because I was in a presidential detainee cell, no charges, in Lusaka Central Prison, so cell 11, and I had in there industrialists, mine owners. There was an Indian Hindu mine owner who had his mine confiscated and he was just thrown in prison. There was a businessman from Mali, a Muslim, who had just been accused of being a spy. They threw him into prison. There's a South African truck driver who had lent money to the ANC cadres there, and instead of paying him back, they said he was a spy, so he got thrown there, tortured and so on. There was Sandhurst graduates South Africa. And so I'm learning from all these people a whole range of interesting things. And what they had to tell me was intriguing about how Zambia works. He said, oh, well, Anglo-American hasn't given a raise in the salaries for years because they don't need to worry about unions. They've all been banned here in Zambia because Zambia is now a socialist country. And when the workers try to march, oh, the police or army just march out and they shoot the rioters, and that's it, you know, and they control the media, so there's no deal about this. And so how much easier than having to deal with competitors and so on, they just buy out the government. And so big business and big government, communism and capitalism work together very well. But it doesn't help the free market or the individual farmer or home businessman and so on. We lose out. I mean, the real people lose out, but the peasants, of course, they get plowed under and massacred, like in Madabiland under the 5th Brigade. But big business, the multinationals, they are right together. So I've got a fact on this. In 1995, that's a year after Mandela became president of South Africa, the CEO of Anglo-American and De Beers, we're talking about Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer writes an op-ed piece in the Star in South Africa, the biggest newspaper, a full op-ed, full page with his picture. This is what we've been working for over 33 years. Anglo-American, under my leadership, has been negotiating with the ANC and working to undermine National Party government to bring about the ANC in power, which we now have. Now, this isn't a conspiracy theory. This is Harry Oppenheimer, CEO of Anglo-American, declaring to the world, we worked to subvert the South African government for 33 years to bring the ANC, of course, he didn't call him communist, but to bring communist power in our country effectively. And he is boasting of this. So this is not exactly unusual. We've got books like Tragedy and Hope by Quigley and others documenting that the communists and the capitalists in many cases are working hand in glove.
But this is interesting because so right now we've got this big narrative of white monopoly capital, and it seems to me that they're sort of half right. They've picked up on the fact that the ANC are funded by large white Western capitalists who arrange special patrimonial relationships to protect their extractive industries. But they still see the solution as being more socialism, and they construe these white foreigners as being ethnically contiguous with white South Africans, when I don't think I've ever met anyone who thought of these people as part of their community my entire life.
Yes. Now, this is intriguing. Now, you know what the worst crime is you could possibly commit in South Africa? Illegal diamond buying, IDB. Now, under the old South Africa, under the present South Africa, you will get a heavier sentence than for murder or even for tax evasion. Can you imagine? I mean, one of the worst things you could do in almost any government is tax evasion. But illegal diamond buying in South Africa is that serious. So, for example, to show you how strong De Beers controls the Southern government, past and present, is that if you have a farm and you find a diamond on your farm, belongs to De Beers. If you are scuba diving in Orange River or off the coast, and you find diamond, it belongs to De Beers. This is true for Namibia. This is true for South Africa. I believe it's true for Botswana too. Any
But
diamond,
Botswana
any diamond.
they have a sharing deal, I believe. They managed to get
Okay.
a 50-50 split, I think.
Right. So it's half of it belongs to
Yeah.
So, which is a better deal. At least some of it belongs to you. But in our country at this moment, if you find a diamond that you've dug out of your own farm that you own, that uncut diamond belongs to De Beers. And if you do otherwise, you are in deep trouble, and the law is merciless, which just goes to far more serious than murdering a farmer and his wife and torturing the kid to death in front of the farmer. Far more serious than anything else is illegal diamond buying. Now, this is just giving you an idea that this bunch who give the rhetoric of Marxist revolution and the people and et cetera, they're just in the pay of the same people. It's so corrupt. And in fact, I would have expected Nelson Mandela to have weakened this, but in fact, he strengthened the De Beers Anglo-American control in South Africa, and he even strengthened the penalties of people involved in illegal diamond buying. This does not fit the narrative. But the other thing is, do you know that when Nelson Mandela came out of prison,
wasn't he invited into one of these international secret clubs somewhere around?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Well, he was made what was the 32 level Freemason, just for starters, and
all the levels.
Knights of Malta and all of this. But you know that there was a British controller. They called him his handler. He's a big New World Order guy called
Robin Renwick.
Give his name again.
Lord Robin Renwick, Labour peer.
That's it, Lord Robin Renwick. Quite right. Now, he was the handler for Nelson Mandela, who helped his campaign to bring him to power. Well, do you know who is the handler for old EFF leader Julius Malema? The same.
I thought it was Nathan Kirsch, but I'm sure you're going to tell me it's Renwick as well.
Possibly, he might be involved as well. But there are pictures of old Julius Malema, Juju, meeting with Renwick, looking very pally, both of them looking extremely pally together. And regularly, here's Juju, who gives all the communist rhetoric and expropriation compensation rhetoric. And he goes off to London regularly, I think, to get his orders. So, you know, what is going on here? But then you look in this day of Wuhan Health Organization, COVID cult, lockdown lunacy, you see all over the world the same agenda being played out: take out people's freedoms, suspend the Bill of Rights, sideline Parliament, rule by committee of 6. And who's involved and who's running the whole show? Well, the same people. And whether you're talking about Africa, Asia, or Europe or America, we've got the same agenda. So I've got to say the whole New World Order bunch, they're working together, and they might have in this hand the communist puppet, in this hand the capitalist puppet. But you know, they're working for the same team, it seems.
Yes, I think there seems to be a consensus amongst people at that level of society of what the correct way of governing the world is. And in those parts of the world where people don't pay a lot of attention, they can do it far more ruthlessly than they can in, say, the United States or Western Europe.
Yes. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, just in the last few weeks, the president of Tanzania died. Very unexpectedly.
Yes, interestingly, he and the other African president who refused to do lockdown, the president of Burundi, both died very shortly after rejecting these programs.
Yes. Now, I've just been with a group of Tanzanians who've told me they are convinced that the president was murdered. And you need to look into this further, because now he's the one who called out the World Health Organization, or the Wuhan Health Organization, as we call it these days, as a bunch of frauds. He's a medical doctor, and the president of Tanzania sent in all kinds of different things, including from a goat and from papaya and so on.
Yes, I remember this.
Exactly. So he ridiculed him. No lockdown, Tanzania, none of this masquerade, and he told the WHO to get lost. Well, now, he's not only died suddenly, and he's a young man. Well, I mean, he's the same age as me. He's about 61, and he's suddenly dead. He's a healthy man, no prior condition, didn't make sense. But look at who's replaced him. His vice president has got the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation fingerprints all over. Totally owned by New World Order.
Actually larger than the United Nations now as an organization in terms of capital investment.
So there's something very sinister that's just gone on in Tanzania. And I was alerted this by some Tanzanian friends just recently. And as I looked into it, it's all the lights start coming on. When you look at the new vice president is bought and paid for by Bill and Melinda Gates.
Yes, no, and they have some rather underhanded tactics. I should probably send it to you. There's actually a very, very good academic publication that where someone actually did a proper breakdown of their activities across several continents. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we know about sort of the general broad strokes of things like, okay, they're into population control, sterilization, and trying to monopolize the vaccine industry. But the details of it are quite hairy, especially when you look at the fraud that they commit into getting parents to use their children as guinea pigs for new vaccine products, which often leave them paralyzed or otherwise permanently damaged with severe autoimmune diseases.
Yes, I've just gone through a whole series, a whole 9-part series of The Truth About Vaccines. And it was meant to be a 7-part series, but then they've added 2 more updates since. And it's absolutely staggering. And what was done in India, for example, the Indian government did the first ever parliamentary level investigation to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and found that there were tens of thousands of people in India who were paralyzed and permanently damaged as a result of their inoculation. I think it was the polio inoculation program, and they banned them from India for this. Kenya has come out with a report on how there were not tens of thousands, I believe just hundreds of thousands of young girls who were sterilized under the guise of, without them knowing, for no informed consent, under guise of getting a vaccination. It turned out to be an experimental sterilization that they'll never be able to have children, a type of thing under the guise of inoculations. Now, the Moderna and Pfizer and these other different vaccination companies have been described by John F. Kennedy Jr. in his Children's Health Defense as being serial criminal convicted felons, that they have had to pay something in the region of $35 billion, that's billion with a B, in fines for criminal activities in the United States alone, which is nothing to do with the vaccines, because vaccines have got immunity from liability. But other medicines that they produce or drugs, should we say, they have had to pay billions in admission of guilt fines for crimes that they've done. Now, companies like Pfizer, who are serial felons, convicted felons, why would you trust them when it comes to vaccines where there's not even any liability for it? So when you've got people like Bill and Melinda Gates who are eugenicists, who would like to bring the world's population down several billion, down to under 1 billion, down to under 500 million, maybe even 100 million, when they come out with a vaccine that they say this vaccine is going to extend your life expectancy, isn't this a bit of a conflict of interest that people who would like to massively depopulate, dramatically depopulate the world, are coming up with a vaccine which they've got liability from they've got immunity from liability and prosecution from, and they're saying this is going to extend our life expectancy and improve our health while they make billions out of people being sick. So I see a conflict of interest here.
Well, I mean, I think that's the one way I would explain that one away, if I was so inclined, would be to say that they are simply making money, which is itself bad enough. Because
it's more than that, isn't it?
Well, I mean, sure. My gut feeling does go in that direction, but I have to be honest. Until I get my hands on concrete evidence, I can't personally say so.
Yes.
But I will say that I think we know quite well how pharmaceutical companies exploiting and bribing political systems across the world to gain preferential treatment, monopoly status, and vaccines are the easiest way to get a monopoly status, because you get a single formula that is centrally distributed or with a single tender.
Yes, and the marketing's been brilliant because everyone's been marketing the need for a vaccine. Like, even though there are virologists, bacteriologists, and other medical specialists say there's no such thing as a vaccine for a virus, and it is a fraud. Well, that's out of my field of expertise, but I don't see why I need a vaccine for a virus that I've already had and recovered from, and which you've got a 99% chance of survival from. So you've got more chance of being damaged by the vaccine or dying of the vaccine than you have of dying of the virus. So why would you go out of your way and pay money to get a vaccine when you don't need it? And there's more danger in the vaccine than there is in the virus.
Mm. Yeah, no, I mean, there've been a lot of very sort of staunch criticisms against this whole program, and one of the most peculiar ones is that here in the Netherlands, they've actually for a long time they used to have a position where it would be, it was a big case. I think it was back in the early 60s. They made it illegal to force anyone to take a vaccine, and it was on that basis that Loke Hulsman justified legalizing drugs by saying that it was a lifestyle choice and therefore a matter of conscience, equivalent to that of deciding not to take vaccines for religious reasons, like Jehovah's Witnesses or so. And so all of these like long-standing norms that have had enormously powerful effects on institutions over time are being swept away very, very rapidly for this kind of very strange, large-scale public-private partnership to enforce this experimental medical treatment across the entire country. It seems to me, across the whole world, actually.
Yes.
And it seems to me extremely unwise, to put it the most mildly.
It most certainly is. It's gross invasion, not just of your privacy, violation of many people's consciences, but just think in terms of, there's a biblical warning. Many people know of Revelation 13, the beast, and so on, but there's just taking the big picture. I know there's many interpretations, but the big picture of Romans 13 is it's speaking about a satanic plan to create a one world government with a one world economic system and a one world interfaith religious system. I don't know if this rings any bells anywhere, but
well, I mean, you can look at the United Religions Initiative, which has been going on since the end of the Second World War. People talk about the New World Order as if it's some sort of plan for the future, but I mean, if I remember correctly, that was actually just the name for what was set up after World War II. Sort of a banal description of the global governance schemes that are being continually deepened. And I think that if we want to be a little bit less sort of scary to the people who are of a secular mindset, I think there's a more sort of symbolic and poetic take on the whole sign of the beast that I've come across, which is that so at the time, I don't know if I'm sure you've heard this interpretation before yourself, but the one in which it's the number of the beast is code for Emperor Nero. It's a code for his name, and therefore it's a symbol of imperial power, arbitrary imperial power. And so to resist the imperial power of global states is in itself sort of something that has a generic moral imperative embedded in the Christian religion.
Yes, the moment anyone says you need to have this or that, or you won't be allowed to buy, sell, trade, move, fly, whatever, it violates one's essence of what it is to be free. We're meant to be free people with a free conscience, and the moment they try and bring in compulsion, this year, 2021, is the 500th anniversary of Professor Martin Luther making his bold stand in front of the emperor. My conscience is kept to the word of God. Here I stand. It is unsafe to do anything against one's conscience. Popes and councils have often erred and contradict themselves. My conscience is captive to the word of God. And so this stand that Martin Luther made had in seed form all the elements of modern Western freedoms: freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. There were so many freedoms encapsulated in, and also constitutionalism, that it's not rex lex, rex being Latin for king and lex being Latin for law,
Law is
not rex
master.
lex, but they inverted it to lex rex. The law is king. The king is under the law. And most dramatically demonstrate when Parliament put King Charles I on trial for treason. So the whole principle that the law is king and everyone is under the law, and the law is God's law, not just man's opinions. So I think that this year, 2021, it's so important for us to remember this key principle made by Martin Luther. Our conscience needs to be free. It needs to be informed, of course. We want our conscience to be informed by truth, because it's possible to be sincerely wrong. And that's why my conscience needs an anchor in objective reality. I can't just allow it to be subjectively swayed by the media and by emotions and by public opinion and peer pressure. And this is the essence of what it is to be a free person in Western civilization, that we have freedom of conscience. And the way they're bullying and intimidating and trying to censor and deplatform and delete anything. And it's like George Orwell's 1984. We've got thought police out there trying to penalize us for thought crimes. And when I read this as a textbook, I was brought up in Rhodesia in school in 1984, so it was a textbook, as was Animal Farm. And I remember looking at this thinking, it's very funny, but I mean, it's just not possible. I mean, nobody could do
Exactly.
that.
It inoculates you. By bringing it up, it actually acts as an inoculation. It's like a little mental vaccine against the idea that it's possible.
Yeah, well, yes, I didn't think it was possible. And what have we seen in the last year? Thought crimes, thought police. I mean, it's just bizarre. And how they can, you can be unpersoned and disappear down the memory hole, vaporized. You know,
well, I mean,
all this, it's coming about.
Well, I think the most remarkable, I mean, look, we talk about cancel culture, and most of it is sort of meaningless. But there is an aspect to this. If you look at what happens to some people who get, I mean, these aren't all savory people, but you know, their rights do matter. And I'm talking about, you know, Tommy Robinson, Laura Towler, Curtis Yarvin, you know, all of these people. What happens to them is that they get denied the right to actually open a bank account. So the global financial system will coordinate so that they can't get a bank account. And the people who are running, for example, Gab, that alternative version to Twitter, getting shut out. They're getting shut out of bank accounts if you don't obey the censor guidelines. You can't even get a bank account, which shows that the level of coordination on this stuff is highly centralized.
It's bizarre to think that a country like Great Britain, which we thought was a bastion of freedom of speech and thought and so on. I mean, all kinds of evils and perversions are free, but it seems you can't tell the truth. That has now become the new treason. And just insane how they can, it's not just that you've got a different opinion. It's not just that they think you're wrong. It's that you're evil and you're not even allowed to voice another opinion. That's just so dangerous for freedom. You need freedom of thought and freedom of speech to be able to have freedom.
Absolutely. On that note, I'm going to end the recording. So I hope that the viewers have enjoyed this. I've certainly have. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm going to have to talk to you again in the future because there's so many threads over here that I'd love to pick up on. But thank you very much for coming. I've enjoyed this a great deal.
Thank you, Robert. And if anyone wants to get any information from me directly, my email is peter@frontline.org.za, peter@frontline.org.za, website's frontlinemissionsa.org.
All right. Thank you.